Well, let's cross live now to Serbian-American journalist and blogger Nebojša Malić. Thank you so much for joining us. The self-proclaimed Republic of Kosovo has agreed to postpone a ban on Serbian car documents and license plates until September the 1st. What do you think will happen then?
Well, it depends on who's really pulling the strings. The decision to postpone this was undertaken after the U.S. ambassador advised it to the government in Pristina, which does generally whatever the Americans tell it to. I initially thought when the crisis first broke out on Sunday morning that this was actually a move by the United States through the ethnic Albanian government to open up some kind of second front to distract from the situation in Ukraine. However, towards the end of the day, it became increasingly obvious that it was not the case, even though Prime Minister Kurti had just been to Washington and had been feted and celebrated by Secretary Blinken and the State Department. It seems that he actually decided to act unilaterally, make a move on this, and the ferocity of the response from Serbia, as well as the Russian Foreign Ministry, sent a message that they will not just roll over and tolerate this, at which point the American ambassador in Pristina said, well, okay, there's been some misinformation and misunderstanding, and let's just postpone this for a month and continue negotiations and see if we can work it out peacefully. So in this case, it seems like the Pristina and its Western backers blinked. I'm not sure they will do that again.
Do you think that this postponement will actually help de-escalate the situation, or is it really just postponing, essentially kicking the can down the road?
Obviously, it is kicking the can down the road, but depending on what Washington wants in this situation, and that will sort of determine how the ethnic Albanians act, it might at least freeze the conflict a little longer. Serbia, from everything that I've seen, is fine with the conflict remaining at status quo. They are just not willing to recognize the breakaway province as independent. There is no Serbian government that I can see possibly being put together that would survive such a move at home, but they're willing to keep negotiating infinitely if that's what, lets them keep relatively decent relations with the West. It's the EU and specifically the US that have recently started pressuring them to do so as sort of a prerequisite. So it's recognizing Kosovo and sanctioning Russia that are two prerequisites for them to progress on their hypothetical path of European integrations, which is not going to happen for at least another 5 to 10 years at best, especially given the current problems in the EU. And that's not even bringing the Ukraine conflict into consideration. So it's literally the government, Kurti's government, that is in a rush to do something because they don't really have solutions to internal problems. And as President Trump's former envoy, Richard Grenell, who had negotiated some economic agreements 2 years ago, let loose in a tirade on Twitter on Sunday evening, this is entirely Kurti's doing, trying to distract from his domestic failures.
Well, what do you make of the comment by the Serbian president earlier where he stated that his country will win, that Serbia will win if his people are persecuted? Just take a listen to what he said.
In a more difficult and tough situation than today. Why have I said that? The Pristina regime is trying, by presenting itself as a victim, to exploit the mood in the world. All I can say is that we will ask for peace, but I will tell you right away, there will be no surrender and Serbia will win. If they try to start persecuting the Serbs, bullying the Serbs, killing the Serbs, Serbia will win.
What do you think he meant by his statement?
So I understood it as a clear message that Belgrade will not allow another 2004 or another 1999 to happen. In 1999, when the Yugoslav military retreated and handed the province over to NATO, according to the UN-brokered armistice, NATO was supposed to safeguard everybody, but instead they turned the province over to the ethnic Albanian militants. And over 200,000 people, mostly Serbs, but as well as other non-Albanians, were forced to leave. And in 2004, in order to pressure the international community into granting Kosovo independence, some 50,000 Albanians rampaged across the province for almost a week before the American peacekeepers finally, told them to stop. And other peacekeepers couldn't or wouldn't do anything about it. And so I think Belgrade is trying to send a message that they will actually use force if necessary to defend the remaining Serbs there and their civil and human rights. And again, with Russia backing up Belgrade on this, it may have tipped the scales enough to inform Pristina and its Western backers, who are, again, the actual decision makers here, that, this is not the kind of fight they want to pick right now. Perhaps they'll try again in a month. I'm not sure. But a lot of things can change until then.
And at the same time, we are hearing from the NATO-led peacekeeping force in Kosovo, which has announced that it is ready to intervene. So what's your take on that? What will it take to kickstart their involvement?
Well, it depends on what they mean by intervention. I mean, they've already, if the news about the Carabinieri being deployed along the bridge is correct, they're already trying to separate the two sides. And this bridge has sort of been a site of many battles between ethnic Albanians and the local Serbs. And if they're policing the bridge, that means they're trying to stop another pogrom, which is good, which is great. There's about 3,500 or so NATO troops in there. Their function is purely symbolic. If the ethnic Albanians decided to stage another insurgency and attack the remaining Serbs, I don't think there was political will or military readiness by NATO to stop them. Their job is essentially to intimidate Serbia from trying to retake Kosovo by force. But there's no political will or military readiness to do so in Belgrade.
And of course, the country has had a difficult past of NATO's intervention. What do you think are the chances that we're looking at a situation where history repeats itself?
It is not 1999 any longer. The world has changed, and not just because of what happened over the past 6 months, but because of what's been happening for the past 25 years. And so if NATO thinks that they can repeat what happened in 99 and that they can, bomb for 78 days a country with impunity, I think even they don't think that today anymore. So I think the conflict has not been resolved, much as some people would like to pretend it was, but it hasn't been. And that I think both sides are sort of trying to maneuver and position themselves and create a fait accompli that would help them in the current changing world situation. And so the Albanians are trying to fortify their position just in case American power slips, whereas the Serbs are sort of biding their time, expecting Russian power to grow. And it's a zero-sum game, unfortunately.
And looking at that zero-sum game, we've heard from the EU foreign policy chief, who stated that the relation between Serbia and the self-proclaimed Republic of Kosovo has to be established with the bloc's help. In your opinion, does the EU have a right to intrude into what is essentially Serbia's internal affairs?
So the EU appointed itself sort of a legal guardian of Kosovo with this whole legal mission, and under the present arrangement, they technically delegate the viceroy there, the UN viceroy. But the irony of the situation is that Borrell comes from Spain, and Spain is one of the 5 EU member states that did not recognize Kosovo because that precedent, Madrid fears that this precedent would encourage their own separatists in Catalonia. So the EU honestly cannot broker this because they've already said their bottom line is Serbia must recognize Kosovo, but 5 EU members themselves do not. So the bloc is really sort of in a paradoxical position, and they don't have a leg to stand on. And besides, everybody in the region, as well as elsewhere, knows that the Albanians answer directly to the U.S., and it's really the Americans that one should negotiate with in order to resolve the conflict. And so you basically have the Serbs and the Albanians locked in a mutual struggle, and then you have the U.S. and Russia as sort of, big brothers on both sides. And there's currently, obviously, a very strong proxy conflict between them, and the Balkans risks getting dragged into that because of the crisis in Ukraine, and that further complicates things.
As you correctly say, the conflict is far from being solved, and the timing, although you say might not be significant, is certainly interesting. Well, we'll be keeping an eye on this. Nebojša Malić, a Serbian-American journalist and blogger, thank you very much for joining us here on RT.